like to welcome everyone this morning. Now we've still got folks making their way to class, which is fine. I do. I clear a room quickly. It's like I get up here, people run. Sorry, I'm waiting on Cindy Thurman to leave the room. Cindy Thurman, please leave the auditorium. Cindy Thurman, please leave the auditorium. Now, we are glad to have each of you with us this morning. Oh, you got it. Okay.
All right. Oh, what a morning.
Busy.
Yeah. You like it when someone grabs you right as you're coming out of the baptistry and says, do you want to do another one?
You can't beat that.
Yeah. And okay.
And one of the things that I learned today is how to get out of a traffic ticket. Just say, I'm going to a baptism.
Did you really get out of one?
No, that's what he said this morning.
Okay.
He said, he's on his way here and he got pulled over, and his daughter was upset because she was going to be late to her baptism, and so the police officer let him go.
That happened this morning?
Yeah. First baptism.
Really?
Yes. Where were you?
I was getting ready for the second baptism.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Okay.
I've run all over this church building this morning.
Now, am I telling the truth on that? Yeah, all right.
All right, I was in the process of trying to make sure everything was being recorded and filmed and all that good stuff. So, yeah, I missed out on that, trying to get ready for the second one. So, anyway, wonderful morning. So good to see everybody. Thanks for coming out this morning. And, Lee, good to see you, as always. And we're moving into a kind of an odd text. In some ways, you look at it and you go, okay, is this kind of like opening chapters of Chronicles where you have all these genealogies that you just skip? And if you do that, you probably lose out on some things. And so let's dive in. This is the thing I think both of us want you to realize, is that after the creation, when everything goes from chaos to order, and sin enters, well, sin sends creation back into chaos and disorder. And we're going to see that most of all, Lee, coming up with the flood, as the waters caved back in that had been separated,
right?
In the opening chapter there in Genesis. And watch the way sin is developing. It begins with eating fruit that God said don't eat. It moves from that to killing one's brother, kind of a big jump, wouldn't you admit? I mean, it's one thing to eat the cookie your mother told you not to eat. It's another thing to kill your sister for eating a cookie. I mean, so you have fratricide occurring here for the first time. And, of course, you get all of this, am I my brother's keeper? Why would you expect me to be that? And, of course, the answer is, yes, you are the brother's keeper. And so God then curses him, and just kind of describe again, and I know we went over this last week, but kind of bring us up to date, Lee. What's unique about this curse?
Yeah, well, I mean, you think about it. It says, when you work the ground, it'll no longer yield its crops for you. You'll be a restless wanderer on the earth. I mean, what exactly is he going to be doing? He's going to be wandering the earth. How much of the earth is there that he's wandering at that point? And as it leads into it later on, of course, he's talking about well, this is too much for me. Well, God doesn't give us more than what we can bear. Even in a situation like that, Cain still, even after, and I think maybe sometimes, at least I do, maybe lose sight of this, even after killing his brother, Cain could get back into a right relationship with God. I mean, he could do it. It never looks like he does based on what we find, but he could have. But instead, he, again, doesn't take responsibility, doesn't want to take responsibility. This is too much for me. Almost trying to say, this is your fault, God.
Yeah. And of course, remember, Cain was a farmer. Mm-hmm. And so to be banished from the land is to be banished from what he was so used to doing. And of course, like you said, my punishment is more than I can bear. Today you're driving me from the land, and I'll be hidden from your presence. I'll be a restless wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me. Now, once again, you're faced with one of the problems you have in the opening chapters of Genesis, and that is, who is there out there to kill him? Okay? I mean, right now it's Adam, Eve, Cain, Abel's dead. Now you say, well, Adam and Eve had other children. They had other children, but whether they had them yet, I don't know. But let's say they did have them. I mean, even if you count for several hundred being born, you still have to ask yourself, is he going to wander? I mean, wouldn't these several hundred have lived close together? And I think, again, we're probably asking the wrong questions. We hear it all the time. Who did Cain marry? We'll see that here in a moment. Who was trying to kill him? I think those questions should force us to step back and ask, are we reading the text the way the inspired writer wanted us to read the text?
And as well, who he's writing it to at that point, they're not concerned with this. That's not what's important in what Moses is trying to get across. Again, the Scripture's written, as you've mentioned on numerous occasions, Scripture's written for us, but it wasn't written to us directly. And so that's where we have to try to get back, as much as we can, get back to where the Israelites were and try to put ourselves in their position.
And once again, a lot of this has to do with when this part of Genesis is being finished, being written. I believe that Moses wrote the Torah, the law. Moses gave us the law. But did Moses write everything from Genesis to Deuteronomy? And if he did, of course, you have Moses writing about his own death at the end of Deuteronomy, which seems extremely strange. And then you also have the phrase at the very end of Deuteronomy that says, there has not been a prophet who has been like Moses to this day, as if whoever's writing it is living way past Moses' death. And so that's one of the areas that I'll go ahead and share with you that I'm constantly struggling with. When was the final 5 books of Moses finished? Now, are they all inspired? Absolutely. But was there more than one author? I think the text requires us to say, while Moses wrote the law, somebody else finished the Pentateuch. Now, who was it that finished? Some would say Joshua. Some would say Samuel.
Yeah.
Some would say even down as late as Ezra. And I have to admit that I've been slowly over time readjusting my views on this, because I keep asking the question, what is the final writer trying to say to his audience at that time? And that's always a challenge. And I'll just go ahead and let you know, I've been moving more toward an Ezra dating of it, which is really late. This would be after the exile to Babylon. Others would date it way before that. Now, again, don't get me wrong. I believe that the Torah was written by Moses, and they had the Torah the whole time, the law. But did they have all the stories of Genesis, all the stories, at the end of Deuteronomy, and all that packaged together? And so that's just kind of where but as I tell people all the time, when they say, what's your view on such and such? I says, what day of the week is it? because my view on these things change as I continue to study. So to me, the question of he's afraid that whoever's going to find him kills him, and we ask who could that be, I think we're asking the wrong question. He's concerned somebody is going to kill him.
Yeah, that's what it's coming down to, is that, you know, he has a worry, he has a concern. And based on God's response, there's, God's kind of trying to, keep an eye on things as well.
Which is exactly what you see. Who is Cain afraid of? We don't know. But the Lord said to him, not so. Anyone who kills Cain will suffer vengeance 7 times over. I don't know what that means, but
I don't think you want it.
yeah, and no, you definitely don't want it. And we know that in Old Testament law that if you stole, a sheep or a bull or a goat, you usually had to repay that 4 times, 5 times, multiple of times in order to show and this is the same kind of thing. You kill Cain, God's going to visit on you his vengeance 7 times. And so the Lord put a mark on Cain. And you wrote me and told me you'd figured out finally what that mark was.
Yes.
All right.
I'm not telling anybody else.
Oh, you're not telling anybody else. Okay.
No. Yeah, who knows?
Yeah, the big question again, what's the mark of Cain? And we don't know. That's simply the text does not. But it's something that would alert people, hands off this guy. Hands off. Do not touch him. And again, you speculate all day long what that is. We simply don't know. And so Cain went out from the Lord's presence, lived in the land of Nod. I think Nod means wandering, if I'm not wrong. But we know it's east of Eden.
Yeah, and it was obviously a great place to take a nap.
Before you nod off.
Nod off.
There you go. I knew you would come up with something good one on
I'm
that one.
happy to help.
Thank you, Brother Lee, on that one. And then, of course, here's the next question. Cain made love to his wife. She became pregnant, gave birth to Enoch. Where did he get a wife? And, of course, you say, well, he married one of his sisters. And that wasn't unusual. Who else married a sister? Abraham. Yeah, Abraham married a half-sister. And so this wasn't unusual. By the way, marrying relatives, very common among royalty in the ancient world. They didn't want the royal blood outside the family line. Very common among the tribes of Israel. They oftentimes tried to keep the tribe of Levite, marry a Levite. The tribe of Judah, marry a Jew or a Judahite at the time. But whoever it was, they married. Again, the point is not that they didn't marry. That's assumed. But they give birth to Enoch. And with Enoch begins in chapter 4 what we call the genealogical line of Cain. And again, you read it and you're like, why should I care who begot who, right? I mean, that's all that you're going to get here. I'm a genealogist. I love this stuff. Anytime I do a funeral, the first thing I do is sit down and try to figure out where this person came from. And sometimes that's fun, and sometimes it's not so fun.
Sometimes you learn more than what you had bargained on.
You would be amazed at how many times I've looked and went, I better leave that out of the funeral. Because, and by the way, if you don't know how much information is out there on you or your family, you would be shocked. Tremendous amount of information out there, which is why your identity oftentimes can be stolen so easily. But he gives birth to Enoch, and then, Lee, what is this? He builds a city.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like it's the first, this first city we're aware of, being built. Names it after his son. Is it a situation where he's wanting to keep the family all together in one place? Is it, it's hard to know, or maybe he's built it as maybe protection for himself, so that he's got less likelihood of being attacked or killed for what he did.
One of the things you need to remember is that city in the ancient world is not city today. When you think, somebody said to me, what city did you come from in Mississippi? I'd go, I didn't come from a city, I came from a town. Okay? What's a town? Yeah, it's Ripley, but it's a little bit smaller than a city. Somebody oftentimes say, what's the biggest city near you? Memphis, from where I was raised. And then my mother was born and raised in Dumas. Now people would say, well, was Dumas a city? No. Was it a town? No. What was it? A post office. Okay? Y'all remember those. Little crossroads, you had a general store, a post office, and some churches. Now, would they have called themselves a town back then? They would have. But today, if somebody said, okay, your mother was from where? You can still go to Dumas. There's just nothing there. Okay? And it's like a lot of the little communities all around, not so much Davidson County anymore, but the surrounding counties especially.
When sometimes people would ask me, where did your mom, where was she from? I said she was from Ostella.
Where?
Ostella.
Ostella.
I said, but I have to explain that, which is near Cornersville, which is near Lewisburg. Once you mention Lewisburg, people have a little bit better idea, at least of the general area of where you're talking about. But Ostella, was one of those places. I mean, it was a little bump in the road, where my grandparents had their farm. You went up the hill. You could walk up the hill and get to the general store. You could walk a little further and get to the church. And if you went past that, then you were getting closer to the metropolis called Yell. Y-E-L-L, Yell.
Y-E-L-L, all right. And the reason they named it Yell is everybody over in the other town would always yell over there at them. Yeah, there you go. I think what Lee said a few moments ago is more accurate, and that is that we're talking about a walled area, an area where you could live protected, and would have been quite small. We look at the word city and we think of, Nashville. We need to realize that in the ancient world, and Rodney's done this, Rodney's worked over there on the various tells, T-E-L-L, which is the mounds where these walled, and they would have called them cities, right, Rodney? I mean, these were cities, but like you worked at Tell, Dan, how many would have lived on that tell maybe at its highlight? Okay. They live where? Okay, and so Rodney says that you would have the wall city, and then you would have people living outside the walls where they would go into the city if there was danger approaching. But that, maybe a few thousand inside the wall city, and by the way, you had lived literally, house right beside house, all of them connected. The idea of a front yard, backyard didn't exist in the ancient world. I mean, all these houses been very much like apartment complexes today. In fact, some of them on the walls would have been upstairs, some downstairs.
It's kind of like, you think about Jericho and Rahab.
Yes,
she's right there on her house is on the wall. I mean,
yes.
It's right there. So that's probably where a lot of the houses. It wasn't necessarily, I don't know, I'm thinking there wasn't necessarily a ton of separate housing inside the walls. Most of it was probably, I'm guessing, part of the wall itself.
Yeah. And so anyway, Enoch becomes this. And then notice the list real quick. To Enoch was born Irad. Irad was the father of Mehujael. Mehujael was the father of Methusael. Methusael was the father of Lamech. And I should have got Rodney to have read this. He would have read it according to the Hebrew, which I'm not good at, Rodney, so I apologize on that. But you get a very quick genealogy. And the genealogy is, we really don't know hardly anything about any of these, with the exception of Lamech. But it's Lamech that the inspired writer is moving to, because Lamech's going to become kind of this anchor in the genealogy of Cain. And he's going to be there because of what he does. And so watch what he does. So here's Lamech's genealogy. You have Adam first, then Cain, then Enoch, where you have the first city, then Irad, Mehujael, Methusael, Lamech, and so you have these seven. And seven, of course, is an important number in the Old Testament. 7 days of creation. Okay, these seven numbers in the genealogy is important. You're going to see that here in just a moment. And Lamech is interesting for this reason. So,
Yeah. Marries two women, one named Ada, means adornment, the other Zillah, means shadow. So polygamy is introduced.
for the first time, yeah, you have more than one marriage. And again, notice the names. And Rodney, I don't know how accurate our knowledge of ancient names are sometimes, because some would say that Zillah also means the ringing of a bell, the tinkling of a bell, as opposed to shadow. Of course, a lot of those words had double meanings like we do, or triple meanings. But I like Ada, adornment. Mm-hmm. You know, here's someone that evidently, you know, the name kind of means beauty.
You would think beauty.
Yeah. And so, of course, you know, they would have named them as children, not knowing what they would have, you know, grown up. But we have polygamy. But it's not the polygamy that's important. Now, you do have the kids who become responsible for kind of all the stuff we're familiar with. So walk us through that.
Yeah, again, when you, at least I think for a lot of us, and myself included, initially when you first get to these sections, like, yeah, you know,
right.
just buzz on through. But then, you know, when you stop and think about it, you know, here's all the introductions of things, as you say, that we're familiar with. Ada gave birth to Jabal. He's the father of those who live in tents and raise livestock. You know, the people, you know, the sheep, you know,
sheep
everybody. You know, he's the father of all those folks. His brother's name was Jubal. He's the father of all who played stringed instruments and pipes. I'm obviously not related to him because I can't play a lick of anything. And then Zillah also had a son, Tubal-Cain, who forged all kinds of tools out of bronze and iron. Think I'm not related to this person because I am not mechanically inclined. I think I may have mentioned this before, but I'm not allowed to use anything that has to be plugged in. You know, I can use a rock to hammer a nail, but that's about it. But you know, it's interesting, you know, when you see all these introductions of where, you know, these things come from.
And what's interesting about that, Lee, is that, yes, here's the ones that began that, and yet we know that with the flood, that ends. That whole line is gone. And so you're sitting there going again, what's going on in the text? And then, Rodney, I didn't ask you, I'm interested in knowing your opinion. Why do we have Tubal-Cain's sister, Naamah? What is her significance there? Any thoughts? We just don't know. Yeah, you have his sister mentioned, and that's it. It's just like, by the way, here's Tubal-Cain's sister. Well, why are you telling me that? And we don't know. And so you see some of the challenges we have with trying to figure out in the text. Now, by the way, if you had been the recipients of this, you probably knew what was being referred to. You know, it's kind of like in the office, Lee. When we get together for staff meetings, oftentimes people will start throwing out one-liners from movies. I don't know if you've ever done that. But you'll sit there and you'll start throwing out one-liners from movies. Of course, one of my favorite movies, because of the ending of it, is Shawshank Redemption. And so one of the things I oftentimes say is hope is a good thing. Perhaps the best of things. Now, if you know anything about that movie, you know where that comes from. By the way, anybody know the last two words of Shawshank Redemption? Last two words of the movie.
Is it the end?
No. The last two words of the movie is read as he says, I hope. I mean, the whole point of the movie is the power of hope. And literally the last lines is, I hope I can see my friend Andy again. I hope I can get across the border. I hope the Pacific is as blue as it's been in my dreams. I hope. And some of y'all are saying, I hope you don't tell us about that anymore. June knows that's one of my favorite movies, but it's because of that message.
How many times has he watched that movie, June?
As she says, I hope no more. Anyway, all right. And so they would have known these lines of this story. We've lost it to history.
I just out of curiosity, because I haven't looked into it, is Tubal, does that mean like son of, or do we know?
Tubal, Rodney, meaning of that word, do you know? Yeah, I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know. Obviously, it's connected with Cain, so you would think something like that. Now, the thing I think we need to realize is that Cain's genealogy is this world focused. You've got two genealogies appearing side by side, Cain's and Seth's. The difference is phenomenal. In Cain's genealogy, everything's about this world. First city, first shepherds, iron workers,
Yep.
musical instruments. Everything this world focused, and especially when we get to this part. So this is kind of this seventh generation story that's so interesting. Walk us through it.
Yeah, so, and again, you kind of wonder, where did this come from as far as what he's saying? Lamech, it appears to be, is not a guy that you necessarily want to mess with or get on his wrong side. He says to his wives, Adah and Zillah, listen to me, wives of Lamech. Hear my words. I've killed a man for wounding me, a young man for injuring me. So he's already admitting, hey, I'm a violent guy, and I'll take matters into my own hands. If Cain's avenged 7 times, then Lamech 77 times. And so I kind of threw this in here. I guess maybe I sent it to you a couple weeks ago.
Yeah.
But it seems as though, to me, that the arrogance of Lamech seemed to sum up the direction that the vast majority of mankind was heading, and that was away from God. It just seems like everything that he, and as you mentioned, everything was world-centered in their genealogy. Everything seems to be going away from God. The more actions that they take, the further they separate themselves from God. And it's not unlike what we see in our world, today at times. With again, I know as we've talked about, we're extremely concerned with the direction that society is going. And I think it's something we always need to be aware of, always be praying about, and asking for God's guidance, asking for His almost salvation from that at times. At the same time, we also have to recognize that this has happened over and over and over, from the beginning of time onwards. I mean, you see it, the things that were going on here, things going on later, Sodom and Gomorrah, things going on during the time of the judges, the things going on in Rome, at the time of the first century. You can keep going. Things that are done horrific things done in the name of religion. We sometimes call it the Middle Ages. It was better named the Dark Ages.
Yeah.
And the things that, the number of, tens of thousands of people who were tortured, killed because of their, either because of their religious beliefs or because of the power that the religious authorities had. And it just goes on and on and on. We just see, sin just is so prevalent in our world and has been since Satan, first,
Garden of Eden,
tempted Eve to today.
Notice again the increase. Eating forbidden fruit. Okay? Forbidden fruit. Second, murdering your brother. Okay? Third, murdering someone for insulting you, injuring you somehow. But not just murdering them, but saying, if God avenges Cain 7, I'll be avenged 77. Let's just show you how, I mean, it's this, like you said, this incredible arrogance, which, by the way, is the reason when you get to Matthew, and Peter says to Jesus, Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Up to 7 times? We're astonished that they would say there's a limit on forgiveness. But they did in the first century. But notice Jesus. I tell you, not 7 times, but 77. Now, if you grew up like me, the King James said
70 times 7.
70 times 7. And so I used to keep up with, okay, my brother, that was 396. You know, no, seriously. But most likely that's a mistranslation of the King James. Most translations have come back because what he's doing, Jesus is counteracting Lamech. That's the whole point of this number. 77 is to say, the world avenges 77, my people forgives 77. Not a literal number, figurative number to balance the power of evil. And so evil explodes, and Jesus says now righteousness has to counter that. And so, again, probably 77 instead of 70 times 7, but it's meant to be a reflection of this. All right, now we turn to the next line. And the next line gets fascinating because it's the line of Seth, okay? So watch. Adam made love to his wife again. She gave birth to a son and named him Seth, saying, God has granted me another child in place of Abel since Cain killed him. And then, we're really not told anything about Seth.
No.
Just that his line is the one that we follow next, and that Abraham would come through. So Seth also had a son, and he named him Enosh. Now, it's at this point that something important happens. At that time, people began to call on the name of the Lord. So Lee, fascinating text.
Yeah.
I'm not always sure exactly the point. What do you think's going on here?
Yeah, I think I sent you an email on this yesterday. You know, it was just, it seems to be most likely one of two things going on. A lot of times people have suggested calling on the name of the Lord. A lot of times we think of that as a positive. They're looking to God for guidance, looking to God for maybe forgiveness, whatever. But a lot of times when we think about calling on the name of the Lord in that way. However, there is the opposite that can also be the case, where calling on the name of the Lord is more, out of almost like a blasphemous type of situation. Which way was it? I don't know, because when I started doing some research on it yesterday, before I sent that to you, it was like, you had half scholars going this way, you had half going that way, and I'm just like, well, it looks like this is one of those that I'm not just real sure which way to go with it.
Well, let's throw it out to the scholar.
Yes, well, that was my next.
That's right. Rodney, what's the phrase? Rodney said that people had evidently started moving away from God. Of course, God had rejected man, or not rejected man as much as had separated himself from man, sent them out of the garden. Cain had gone out from the presence of the Lord. So Rodney says it's that man had separated himself from God, but realizing he'd separated himself from God is looking back to say, okay, now how can I now rebuild this relationship, because I realize I have to rely upon God. I tend toward that line, Lee, simply because it's mentioned in the line of Seth.
Right.
And because of what's fixing to come up here in just a moment. And so, this idea of calling, praying, God's presence has been removed from mankind. We can't come into His presence anymore. Interestingly, Saul of Tarsus was told to call upon the name of the Lord as he's being baptized. Whoever calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. And so that type of language, rely upon, depend upon. Other thoughts?
You have to remember that as the world developed, people began to worship the stars, the moon, the sun, and they had totally moved away from God. First of all, you only have God.
Yeah.
And there's a movement back for some reason. And of course, it climaxes with Abraham in chapter 11.
Right. Rodney says that as people moving away from God, they start worshiping other things. Moon, sun, stars. You see that over in Romans 1. Paul saying they did not, want to retain the knowledge of God in their mind, and they turned to idolatry. And now some are calling back upon God, with it, of course, culminating with Abraham over in chapter 12. And we'll see that.
So since Rodney's mentioned that it culminates there with Abraham, does that mean we get to skip the rest of chapters 1 through 11, or do we?
No.
Oh,
no.
okay.
No. Primarily because I want to go to this next one. Genesis 5 begins with, this is the written account of Adam's family. Now, it's fascinating that he says Adam's family, but in reality, it's Adam's family through Seth.
Yep.
And so it's Seth's genealogy, because we've already seen Cain. Cain came from Adam, and we have his line. Now we're going to go through Seth's line. And so we're going to see that line here. And what's fascinating, again, is the language that's used. When God created mankind, he made them in the likeness of God. He created them male and female, blessed them, same thing you get over in Genesis chapter 1. And he named them, NIV says mankind. I think it's probably a pretty accurate term, Rodney, there. The word mankind, because the word is Adam, which simply means man. So he named them man or mankind. And notice, it's both male and female. And so both men and women fall under this word Adam. And remember, Adam comes from Adamah, the ground from which God created man. And so we're called Adam. And that's fascinating because, of course, we think of Adam as a proper name. It is a proper name, but it's also a generic name. And so sometimes we need to separate those two and be aware of that. Now, watch how the theme develops. I love the way this goes. When Adam had lived 130 years, he had a son in his own likeness, in his own image.
That sounds familiar.
Yeah, right straight out of Genesis 1. So God creates you in his image, and then you create your children, with Joan out of y'all's image. Which, by the way, let's just face it, oftentimes that word image is exactly true, even though neither one of my sons look anything like me. Mm-hmm. I mean, our oldest son, when he was a baby, looked so much like June, I'm not sure the baby pictures could have been distinguished. And I'm like, wow, But my brother's got a son, and if you put them side by side, they look like twins. Sometimes it is literally the image of. But you have that image. And then notice, after Seth was born, Adam lived 800 years, had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Adam lived a total of 930 years, and then he died. Nothing is said about Cain's line dying.
No.
This line dies. Fascinating difference here. And it appears, Lee, that it's going to be because of a spiritual focus later on. At least that's the best I can see on this. And this becomes very familiar language. You turn over, Seth does the same thing. 105, became the father of Enosh, lived after that 807, had other sons and daughters, altogether 912. That pattern goes all the way through until you get to Noah. Okay? So you begin with the age at fatherhood. What age were you when you became a father?
Ooh, let's see. How old am I now? You get older, you forget how old you are. So I've got to count back. 27.
27. In June, how old was I? What? Too old,
young.
June says. Okay.
She said too young.
Oh, too young. Oh, well, that is true. We were definitely too young.
You need to get your hearing fixed, by the way.
What's that?
You need to get your hearing fixed.
Yes. I'm waiting for these hearing aids over the counter that are coming out soon. June's already got one ordered for me. All right. Age at fatherhood of the next generation. Then the next generation, the son, For instance, if I go back in my genealogy, I can go all the way back and, start the line. First, there was Jesse, and then from Jesse there was his son, which was Henry Thomas, and then Henry Thomas had Hugh Thomas, and Hugh Thomas had Hugh Ralph, and then Hugh Ralph had Lee Hugh, and Lee Hugh had me. There you go. That's the way the line goes. So you get the next generation, and then you get the years of life after the birth of the next generation. That's the pattern all the way through here. Now you go, why? I don't know. The primary thing that seems to stand out is, and they died. That's the thing. Cain's line, we know they're dying. We're not told how old Cain lived to be. These we're told. Why? Watch the genealogies. Again, Lamech's. You get all of these 7 coming down. Okay? Watch this line, Enoch's line, and you see why I'm going to say Enoch here in a moment. You have Adam, you have Seth, you have Enosh, instead of Enoch over here on this side, Canaan, Mahalalel, Jared, and then Enoch. And what you get is that number 7 on both of them. Notice the number. Number 7 in both generations represent the two opposites of the world. Like you said, Lamech is all about sin as crazy as it can be. Enoch is very different. Watch why. Take us through this one if you would.
Yeah, so Enoch had lived 65 years, which is interesting to me because he becomes a father so much younger than everybody else, and maybe there's a reason for that here in a minute. He becomes the father of Methuselah, who is the oldest, he's the oldest person that ever lived on the earth, at least that's recorded, in Genesis. But then, you go into further details with Enoch. I mean, nobody has this much detail in this genealogy.
Yeah, Enoch stands out just like Lamech stands out.
He became the father of Methuselah. He walked faithfully. Again, nobody else is just... Now, it's not to say that there weren't those who as we've already mentioned here, is that it appeared to be people were trying to come back to God. But Enoch is the one, he walked faithfully. I mean, his life stood out from everybody else's. And we're really going to see how he stood out here in a second. With God, he walked 300 years, had other sons and daughters. And then he's no more. He didn't die. It's just because God took him away. He didn't face death. At least as far as what we can see, nothing. He and Elijah. I was about to say Elisha. I thought no, it's the other one. Elijah. The two who are removed from this world, who don't see death in the way that we all see death, or the way we all face death. But that idea of walking faithfully with God and being removed from the world.
Yeah.
And sometimes I kind of wonder, was he removed from the world because of what was coming?
Yeah.
Here's a faithful man. He's doing everything he can to be faithful to God. But we know, as we read a little bit later, and I'm sure we'll get into it next week, is the world is heading in another direction from what Enoch's heading.
But it also shows us one other point that I want you to remember. God's grace steps into the picture. Seth died. All of these others died. You get to the seventh one, and he doesn't die. God suspends the punishment. You eat from the tree, you'll die. You sin, and he wasn't a perfect human being, but he walked faithfully with God, and God takes him. And watch what the Hebrew writer does with this. By faith, Enoch was taken from this life so that he did not experience death. That was the point for everybody else, all 6 of them before him.
He died.
Died. And all after him. Died, until, like you said, he got to Elijah. But he was taken. Why? He was commended as one who pleased God. Cain's line, rejecting God. Seth's line, number 7, showing us, and again, I think that number is 7 is so significant. What is the ultimate goal? Ultimate goal is to overcome death. And with him, it was the ultimate goal. He didn't experience it at all. Now, again, all kinds of questions. For instance, did he ascend to heaven with this body just like Elijah did? Was it body somehow transformed? How does he exist right now? No answers to any of those questions. Okay? But still, the very interesting aspect there. So we'll pick up right here. Our time is up. So again, keep reading, because now we're going to move really quick into chaos caving in on itself. That's what the flood narrative is all about. So Lee, how about dismissing us in prayer?
God, we do thank you again for this day. We thank you for the time we've enjoyed so far in worshiping you, being reminded of who you are, and how that you're always there for us, that we can call on your name and you will answer, you will hear us. We thank you for the love you show to us each day. Help us to reflect that love to others, to our families, to our friends, to those we work with, to those that we have a hard time with. Help us to always reflect you in our lives and in our relationships with others. We continue to be mindful of those who have suffered loss this past week. We ask a blessing on their families. We ask for your comfort, for your strength. Help us to lift them up as best we can. Thank you again for your Son, for the forgiveness that we have through him. It's in his name we pray.